is the annual kickoff event for the textbook evaluation adoption process for the state of North Carolina. And there are various things that I want to cover with you today concerning the 2022 textbook evaluation adoption cycle, which includes K-12 English language development and K-12 social studies. Our agenda for today is to do an overview of the textbook adoption process, the bid submission process, the evaluation process, and to have an overview of the 2022 invitation, which I hope you all received in an email. We had to do a resend of that so that everybody could actually receive the link to click on, and it is also available on the website. So hopefully if you have not seen it come through your email, you are able to go to DPI's website and go to the textbook adoption web pages. All right, so once we review the invitation, we'll look at next steps for you, and then we'll have a closing. So I will say in advance that this is an informational type meeting where I'm really just trying to provide you with information and then also go over the guidelines and parameters that are set before you in the 2022 invitation so that you have that information as you begin to prepare your bids and then follow the steps in the process to actually become involved in the process. And in light of that, today will not really be a Q&A session. You know that you've received the tentative schedule in the invitation, which outlines that you should be sending any questions that you have to Kina Brands. And once the deadline for those questions, for submitting those questions comes, Kina will distribute those questions to the appropriate people to provide responses. And then all of the questions and all of the responses will be put together in one compiled document. And then that document will be sent out over the publisher's registry and it will be posted on the web page. So you will have access to any questions, and we are asking for all questions to be written, and then all responses will be written as well. If we do happen to answer any questions, please note that we won't be bound by those questions that may be answered today, but we will put responses in the document that you receive with all the questions and answers. So even if we have that opportunity, you still need to submit those questions in writing. All right, so let's take a look at an overview of the process. So I'd like to start by talking about the definition of textbooks because many people, when they hear the word textbooks, especially because some states use the phrase instructional materials more so now than textbook, but North Carolina has a definition for textbook in public school law. And so you can see here that when we talk about textbook adoption in our state, we're really talking about formats that can be either print or non-print. And of course, you can see some examples of what that might look like here. So including anything that requires the use of electronic equipment, but also the hardbound, softbound books as well. So it's pretty open for what textbook means. And it's always up to the publisher in terms of what types of materials, what formats for the materials you want to present for bid consideration. All right, so when we talk about non-print materials, just a little more detail about that. Submissions may include both web and subscription-based materials, and then those things that are technology-based textbook materials and basic learning resources that require the use of electronic devices or equipment. So this is a high-level overview of the adoption process. The invitation, which the board approved on March the 3rd, is the initiation of the whole process. So the board approved the invitation, which is the call for publishers to submit bids. So this is why the invitation is so important to you, because it is the document that outlines everything that you need to know about how to participate in this textbook evaluation and adoption process for our state. Once that happens, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the background, but then we do come to a point where there's an evaluation process. And that evaluation process involves commissioners as well as advisors that they may seek assistance from to review the alignment of the materials that you provide based on standards in the NC Standard Course of Study, and also quality criteria, which the review criteria is also listed in the invitation. And then finally, a few more things happen after that, but then the final result would be that the textbook commissioners would actually write reports, and then those reports and recommendations that they would make based on their findings from their reports will go to the state board to consider for adoption. And then, of course, the end result that we hope for is high quality instructional materials at the lowest cost available for our schools and districts. All right, so in talking about the benefits, we know that the benefits for the districts and schools would be that the resources would be things that are considered aligned with the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. Now, typically in the evaluation criteria, you find that there's a percentage that the department consultants say that you should have aligned as far as the standards are concerned. And so that percentage would be what the reviewers would be looking for, that it would be that percentage or higher. So that is why this first bullet is extremely important, because throughout the review, those advisors are going to be looking for the alignment of all of the standards in your materials, so to see how much or the percentage of those standards that would be aligned with your materials. Another benefit is that the materials will be suitable for the grade level or the instructional level. Again, advisors and commissioners are looking at those things when they're going through the evaluation process. And we also want it to be appropriate for exceptional children and English language learners. So not looking for separate materials for those students, but looking for to make sure that the materials that we do have are also appropriate for those groups of students as well. And then again, as I mentioned, offered at the lowest cost in the nation. So that's always a benefit. The benefits to publishers would be that there's a high profile in the state because your titles are placed on the adopted list, and districts and schools are encouraged to purchase from the list. But in North Carolina, they are not required to purchase from the list, but it's a strong encouragement and recommendation for them to purchase from the list. We also have in North Carolina the North Carolina Publishers Registry, and companies need to register on the Publishers Registry so that you can participate, because only those companies that are on the registry are allowed to participate in the process. Some of you have completed the form for that registry in the past weeks. It is still available if there are people that need to be added. That's kind of an ongoing process. So if there are more representatives at your company who need to be added, then you do need to use the form that is on the website under information for publishers, and at the bottom it would say NC Publishers Registry on a tab, and then when you open that tab, there's a link to click for the form. If you do have any information that needs to be deleted, then you can send that in an email to me. But even if there's a person on there and their title has changed, or some information has changed, still complete the form for those individuals so that the information can be updated from the form. Now, we also ask for publishers not to present any undue pressure toward the State Board of Education, textbook commissioners, textbook evaluation advisors, and NCDPI staff. Currently, the NCDPI staff who are participating in this process would be, of course, myself, supervisors, and others in the Digital Teaching and Learning Division, as well as content area consultants in the Division of Academic Standards, those specifically who are responsible for English language development, EL, as well as social studies and EC. So by undue pressure, just to clarify, is defined as personal contact to advocate for the selection of a particular book or series of books. So if you contact someone and you're really just trying to push whatever your book is, or if you have a series on the list of your that you want considered for adoption, then that would be considered undue pressure, which could provoke that you're removed from participation. Now, that does not include any social contact or presentations or written communication to the commission for reconsideration or clarification. So that's in there because there is an opportunity to present to the textbook commission during evaluation week, so that wouldn't count, as well as any written communication whenever they're having their deliberations and reconsiderations meeting. If you want that opportunity, the communication that you provide for that is allowed. So in North Carolina's textbook adoption process, there are many stakeholders involved for various reasons. And you can see here, we start with our General Assembly, the governor, the state superintendent, State Board of Education. And we also have, of course, the Textbook Commission, evaluation advisors, you, the publishers, and DPI staff. So we know that we have public school laws as well as State Board of Education policies that govern the practices and processes for this adoption process, and also things that dictate the funding and the monies that are available for schools once this process is over. Now, I'm not involved in the funding arm of things or the funding piece of that. I basically work with the Textbook Commission and work on behalf of the state to go through the textbook evaluation and adoption process. And then once that occurs, then the information is passed along, and then those who help with ordering take on that part, and then the funding piece goes along with financial business services. So local CFOs would be responsible for those things, as well as if there are questions for DPI, then the financial business arm on our side. So I was just mentioning general statutes and State Board of Education policies. These are the numbers of those statutes and policies, and these can also be found on our state website. There is a link for textbooks, laws, and policies. If you go to the textbook adoption website in the navigation bar, you would find it there, and you would be able to go through for each general statute and each state board policy. Click on a link that will either take you to the state board website, to their policy manual to see the policies, or to the legislative site to see the general statutes. The general statutes are available in HTML as well as PDF, so you'll be able to view those in either way. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about the textbook adoption process in terms of things that actually happen. So we know that the DPI content consultants have already developed the criteria that will be used for evaluation and selection. That criteria is in the textbook invitation. So when you got your invitation and you started going through it, you should have seen multiple pages where there were sheets for English language development or ELD, K5, 6, 8, 9, 12. And then also there were criteria sheets for the social studies, the various grade levels, and then courses. So those were developed by the DPI content consultants. DPI also drafted the invitation that was just approved. And the invitation, again, contains all the information on the procedures that you have to follow, the tentative timeline for your submission, and then, of course, the criteria for selection. In addition to that, there are attachments in the invitation which show you the contract that will be used, the textbook contract that will be used, the surety bond document, Forms B and M, depending on if you have print materials or non-print materials, and information like that. Now, I'll also mention that there's a checklist or two checklists at the back of the invitation, which show what is needed for your bid submission and what is needed for your bid sample submission. So those details are all in the invitation. The State Board of Education and their legal counsel approve the invitation, and that is what just happened at the March 3rd meeting. They approved, the State Board approved the invitation, and then it was distributed to you all through the Publishers Registry, through a couple of emails, but through the Publishers Registry. All right, so for the textbook adoption process, the Textbook Commission selects the advisors who are going to assist them in looking at the material. And then the textbook commissioners themselves evaluate the bid materials. They have to write reports, and then they provide a recommended list of books to the State Board of Education for approval. Now, for those of you who may have attended the recent State Board meeting, we actually had two things happening relative to our state textbook process, and that's usually not the norm. We actually had the State Board to look at and adopt the recommended list for the 2021 adoption, which included 9-12 mathematics and career and technical education. And then the other item was the approval of the invitation. So we have actually just gone through all of these steps that you see here. And we're now in the phase where contracts are being executed for those publishers who had adopted materials or those things that were recommended and adopted. All right, so when we talk about our State Board of Education, commission members, advisors, and DPI staff, they're all held to the standards of conduct, the State Board Standard of Conduct, and that's on their policy page, policy manual page as well. But we all have to demonstrate a high standards of personal conduct and avoid anything that may be actual or perceived conflicts of interest. And that kind of goes back to the undue pressure and those types of things that we mentioned earlier. Also avoiding solicitation or acceptance of any actual or promise of a favor or reward. So again, very important that you don't place undue pressure on any of us at the agency and the state board and the textbook commission who are involved in this process. And that would be anything that's actual or anything that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause for just a moment here. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the bid submission process, but I do want to pause. And what I would recommend that you do is if any questions have popped up while I've been going over the parts that I've been going over, if you will just jot those questions down or type those questions up so that you can remember to submit those questions as part of the question and answer period in the bid process. Now, I do want to talk a bit about bid submission. So this will be the part that actually comes up next on the tentative timeline, the part where you're getting ready to try to figure out what things you need to be doing, when things are due, how you're going to submit them and all of that. So all of that information is in the invitation. It's all spelled out, all the dates are there. And so I just want to go over a few of those things with you. All right, so the first thing that has to happen is that you'll have to request bid identification numbers. So each submission that you have, everything that you consider a submission, a separate individual submission, requires an identification number that will be issued by DPI. There'll be a Google form to request the identification numbers. So you have to complete that form in order to get your identification numbers. The link to the form is going to be distributed through a message in the publisher's registry, and that will be today. So you will receive an email today with information about how to request those identification numbers. So we're going to go through how that process works in terms of how you get your, not how you get, but once you get your numbers, how that has come to be, what happened for you to get those numbers, and then also how can you, if you decide after you submit that request that you either want to add more bids or that you don't want to submit that many bids. So I'll also talk about that. All right, so the identification numbers issued by DPI are alphanumeric with 3 letters and then 4 numbers. The numbers are actually a number series that are basically assigned by the content area. The character or the 3 letters are going to be designated by DPI based on the publisher or the company's name. So those 3 letters will just be chosen from the name of the company. And then the numbers, we will use the 4000 series of numbers for the base for all the bids for English language development materials, and then the 7100 series of numbers for the base for all social studies bids. We started our numbering system with social studies back in 2016, and social studies at that time was the 7000 series. So moving forward for this second adoption, since the identification number system has been in place, we'll use the 7100 series of numbers. So we'll take a look at that also. All right, so here's an example of bid identification number. So once you get your link and you put in your request in the form to receive bid numbers for however many you decide that you need, this is kind of walking you through what that would look like, the assignment of the numbers, and then what you could do to continue that on if you need to. So we have IPD Publishing Company request 6 identification numbers for English language development materials. So we've said English language development is the 4000 series. So DPI may assign IPD 4000, IPD 4001, 4002, 4003, 4, and 5. These would be the 6 identification numbers requested. All right. So note that IPD is created from the publisher company's name, IPD, which is already initials, so that works great. and it's just used in front of the numbers. So that is the 6 numbers. Those are the 6 identification numbers requested originally. So let's say that IPD Publishing Company requests those 6 numbers, but then once they receive those numbers and the window for requesting numbers is closed, the company decides, hey, we've got 4 more bids that we want to put in this process, things that we think would be good to include. What do? Well, you can actually utilize the numbers that you've already received and continue with numbers to create more bid numbers. Now, you do need to work with the original numbers that DPI has assigned and pick up from the last number, but you are able to create as many more numbers as you would like. Now, on the contrary to that, if you decide that you had requested these 6 numbers and you only want to submit 3 bids, then you can just use the first 3 bid numbers and submit only 3. So you can either add more or take off. It's up to you, whatever your needs are. But in this particular example of the bid number, we're looking at IPD Publishing Company. They had their initial request of 6 numbers. They decide to add 4 more. So what you would do, if this is in your hands now and you're trying to add, your last number that was assigned by DPI was IPD 4005. So you would add 1 to that and get IPD, oops, I forgot to change this on the slide, but you would get IPD 4006, IPD 4007, IPD 4008, and IPD 4009. So those would be the 4 additional numbers that you would use in your bid documents for identification. So showing that, we look at what was originally requested, which is in the gray. These are the additional numbers that we just talked about creating that are in the yellow. So now when we look at IPD's request, they had the original 6 numbers in the orange, in the light orange, but then they wanted to add 4 more as they were creating their bid proposal. So these are the 4 additional ones, giving them a total of 10 bid numbers to use in their bid proposal. All right, so let's say that History First Company requests 4 identification numbers for social studies materials. Well, we said we'll use the 7100 series for social studies. So for History First Company, we may use the letters HFC, and we would say HFC 7100, HFC 7101, HFC 7102, and HFC 7103. So those would be the 4 bid numbers that would be sent back to History First Company based on their requests. Now, again, History First could do the exact same thing. If they want to continue adding a couple more numbers, then their next number would be HFC 7104 and then 7105. All right, so let's just take a moment and pause. And if you have questions, be sure to jot those down or type those up. Any questions that may have come about based on the bid number, the bid ID request. Any questions about requesting them, any questions about how they are created, or any questions about what happens if I want to. So make sure you jot those down or type those up to send in for our written question period. Now, last year, those of you who participated in the process may remember that we used an electronic platform for submissions. We used an electronic platform for submissions that were for the bid proposal, and we also used an electronic platform for bid sample submissions. So we are planning to do the same thing again this year. We know that things are opening up. We're getting just more into being back in person for meetings and things, but we don't know what will be happening in the future. So it was decided that to prepare adequately, that we would go ahead and request information electronically starting off in the process, and then we could make adjustments if we needed to along the way. So We'll be using the platform of Canvas this year. Last year we used a Google site, but we will be moving on to a Canvas platform for our publisher submissions this year. So you'll receive access information for that platform. And once you do, you will be able to download the cost proposal form from the platform, and then you'll be able to submit your bid proposal form in the platform, as well as submitting your bid samples in the platform. Now, a caveat to that is your bid proposals, if you've looked at the invitation, they are due both electronically as well as hard copy. So you're mailing a hard copy of everything required to the address provided in the invitation to me. And you're also submitting an electronic copy in the platform. So the due date is the same for both. So you would need to make sure that both are where they need to be by the particular deadline. And even for the mailed one, you still need to make sure that it reaches its destination by the appropriate deadline and time. So we're really excited about the platform and think that it will be a great experience for you all. Now, one of the big pieces or the big tenets of your bid proposal is going to be the cost proposal form. So I think it's relevant that we take a look at the cost proposal form or an example. There were some examples in the invitation that you could look at. The cost proposal form just works out differently for everybody pretty much. It depends on how you as a publisher are deciding to bid your materials. But I would say to you to be cautious, because your bid document is a document to set up for evaluation of your materials. So we'll talk about, what that document looks like as I go through these examples, but your cost proposal form is really going to be your bid submission. When you enter in your bid numbers and the information about the bid and the components of the bid, that will be utilized. However you set that bid up, the commissioners and the advisors will look at that bid in its entirety as this is what the publisher wants me to review as part of this bid. So we're looking at your bid proposal and the way you set it up on the cost proposal form as the way that you want those materials evaluated. All right, so the cost proposal form is going to be used to enter your bid information and your prices. You'll actually be asked to submit a bid form or cost proposal form that has the cost, and then also submit one without the cost. So we use the one without the cost for our commissioners to look at that so that they can see what they're actually evaluating and reviewing. So we have to have the information without prices for them because they should not be biased by prices. We do keep the prices for at the end of the process when it's time to put all that information together and make the books available for our districts and schools so that we do have the prices that are agreed upon. But the one without prices is necessary also for our evaluation process. So we're asking that when you submit this spreadsheet or when you upload it into the platform, that you name it by your company name and with the words 2022 cost proposal at the back. Now, if you plan to submit a cost proposal for both ELD and a cost proposal for social studies, we ask that you, if you do separate ones, that you be sure that you put social studies or ELD at the back if you're doing two different ones. So put it at the end of the name. All right, so as a publisher, you have lots of decisions to make in this process, and it's up to you which grade level of course you're going to submit the textbook for us to review it, for us to designate it as this is material to look at for grade 5, or this is material to look at for world history. That's totally up to you. So you must clearly state that on your bid form, on your cost proposal form. It must be clearly stated. So there's a column that is on the form that is for grade level or for course. So if you're submitting something that is for a specific course, then you would just put that course name in the column. But if it's for a specific grade like kindergarten or first grade, then we would want you to designate that in the column as well. So just be sure that however you want that reviewed, if it's being reviewed for a specific grade or a specific course, that's what needs to go in the column so that we're aware of that as we're setting things up for evaluation. Now, the materials will only be evaluated for what you specify in that cost proposal form. So if it's not on the cost proposal form, to look at it for whatever grades, then it'll be looked at for whatever grade is indicated on the form. So this information can be found in the beginning of the invitation on pages 1 and 2 of the 2022 invitation, where the parameters are listed. So I would strongly encourage you to look at those 2 pages of parameters. They're all they're all bolded, and they're outlined very specifically and succinctly concerning electronic materials, PDFs for print materials. All of that information is there. So please let that be your starting point for reading the invitation, and then go on through from there. But pages 1 and 2 are the important pages to begin. So in your cost proposal spreadsheet, or along with your cost proposal spreadsheet, you'll receive a set of instructions that pretty much detail about the naming convention of your file when you're finished with it. And also it gives you information about your ISBN. Please be sure that you have a 13-digit ISBN. And if you have components listed in your bid, you also have to have a 13-digit ISBN for each component. So this tells you that whether you're looking at something that's a 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, that needs to be true. And we also ask that you bold the line that has the name of the submission, the bid number, all of that, so we know, okay, this is a bid, and then the things that are not bolded would be considered your components of your bid. And then when you move down to the next bid, same thing, would bold your first line, so we know it's a separate bid, and then the things underneath would not be bolded, so we would know that those are the components. There are also sheets for enrichment material increments if you're providing those, and accompanying student material items. There's specific directions on those pages about what you have to do on those pages and how many things could be included on those pages. So if you're participating with those types of materials, I would definitely say, please read the instructions. They should be very clear in the example that's provided, in the direction, and then also on the page itself where you would enter those things. Sometimes I will mention too, while we're here, you may get a document that has the instructions and examples and then the blank forms, or you may get a document that has instructions and examples separate and then the actual forms to fill out. Either way, if you get the document that has the instructions and everything in it, it is okay if you do want to not include the instructions and the examples when you submit your bid. If you only want to submit sheets in your worksheet that have the actual bid or the EM and the ASM on it. All right, so here's an example of the cost proposal spreadsheet. So when you look at this example of the cost proposal spreadsheet, this is just showing a bid and then some components underneath, grade levels, ISBN, and all of that. This is just to give you an example. It's a very high level example. Don't know how you will set your things up, but this is just here as an example of how the form could be filled in. So you see that there's a column for bid number, so it's very important that for every bid, you include the DPI assigned bid number. If you have bid numbers that you had to add to get a certain number of bids, because you only asked for 4 and you wanted 7, then those bid numbers are considered from DPI as well. So you would include all those in the column for bid number as well. You also want to provide the grade level or course title. So if it's grade 5, you would put that. If it's world history, you would put that. So you just want to designate what you're asking the reviewers to review this for. So if for the grade 5, they're going to look at the grade 5 standard course of study to check for alignment. They would look at all of your materials that are listed and check for the alignment to the standards by whatever percentage is in this criteria. Also, the same would be true where you've designated world history, or where you see that here in the example. The materials would be evaluated using a North Carolina standard course of study for world history. And then that would be the guidelines used for the percentage and the criteria and all of that. So whatever you put on this form is what's going to be used to guide how your materials are evaluated. Now, this isn't all inclusive. This is just a really high level overview type example, really just more about showing you about filling out the form. All right, so we talked about accompanying student materials, or ASM. This just shows you how that might be set up. If you're utilizing that, if you're going to be providing that, sometimes publishers provide this, sometimes they don't. But if you're going to provide it, just be sure you read the information about the ratio and then include all the appropriate information in this form. All right, an example of enrichment materials, same idea. There's ratio information here. So if you're going to utilize this form, you need to make sure that it is inclusive of all the details that are required. And I'll change those out before I post this and send it to you. All right, so let's just take a moment. We've just gone through the cost proposal information. This again is the document that you all would utilize to submit your bid proposals. It's part of the bid proposal package, but it's not everything. And you'll see that as you look at the check sheet in the invitation with all the things that are involved in your bid proposal. But what I would say again is if you pause for just a moment and think about if you had any questions about the cost proposal form, any questions about the other materials, the other two forms that we talked about. If you have questions about those, please be sure to jot those questions down or capture those questions, however you're doing that, so that you would be able to submit them during the Q&A period, which is going on now. You want to make sure that you have all your questions together, because once that time period ends, we're really not supposed to answer a whole lot of questions. So you need to really get in all the questions and really think about it. And if there are others who are going to be involved in actually submitting the bid and putting things together, you really need to share the invitation and this information with them as well, so they're aware of all the guidelines and all the parameters, even if they're just doing a part of it. If you just have somebody that's putting together the cost proposal form, it's still important that they understand what's supposed to go in there. And there's specific pages in the invitation that provide that guidance. What I'm doing today is really just an overview of what's in the invitation, but if you've seen the invitation document, you know that it's a massive document. So it has all the details and information that you need in it. So I would truly encourage you to look over the invitation prior to starting the bid process, as well as prior to starting the bid sample process, because the details are there and you need to make sure that you're following those details as they are outlined. So just be sure of that, and you're going to see me mention that several times when we're talking about the invitation as well. So let's talk about the submission parameters for print materials. Again, this information is on pages 1 and 2 of the invitation, as well as being embedded in other pages in the invitation. But that is the first place where you see all of those details. So you as the publisher need to be sure that your submission is complete and that everything is correctly identified. Now, keep in mind, you're going to be providing your bid electronically as well as hard print and then electronically on a flash drive. So you need to make sure that everything is complete, everything is correctly identified, so that once you start the process and you go into the platform and you're getting ready to upload, you have everything ready once you sit down, or once the person is ready and they're just ready to answer responses and then upload whatever files they need to upload. So it would be really important to do that prior to going into the platform and having your files named correctly and all of those details together prior to using the platform for that. Also, you'll be providing your sample textbook materials. There's a schedule in the tentative schedule. There are dates in the tentative schedule about when to provide those. You still have to provide official DPI samples. The samples that you're going to provide for the commissioners, those samples are going to be provided electronically initially. But for the warehouse, we are asking that if you have print materials, that you provide the print and the digital to the textbook warehouse by a certain date. So there are details about that in the invitation. The checklist would probably show you where that is. You can also see it in the table of contents, but you do need to make sure that you adhere to that because that would be the official copy, the one that's sent to the textbook warehouse or to DPI. Now, sample textbook materials that are print materials. Those materials, we're asking if you will provide those in an electronic PDF format That's on pages 1 and 2. It's also throughout the invitation where it talks about the materials. The electronic versions of the print materials need to be complete, and they need to have the same format and content as your print version. So it needs to be just like a reviewer is opening the book. If the book was there and present for them, they need to be seeing everything that they would see in the book in that electronic PDF. Links and or access information for electronic materials must be provided. So if you have an electronic PDF, we want access to that electronic PDF, however that may be given. All right, all materials must include the identification number that's supplied by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So we'll look at that, how we can put that bid number in your file name. There'll be a slide where we look at making sure that in your samples that the bid number is a part of the file name so that it's easily identifiable by me or staff that need to have access to it. All right, so just pause here for a minute because this is important, just so you're realizing that if you have print materials, there is a process to provide that information electronically. And again, this will be in the platform, in the Canvas platform that we're using. If you have questions about submitting an electronic PDF for your print materials, go ahead and jot those down or capture those questions. Questions about providing links and or access information, jot those questions down. You want to make sure you get all these questions in before the end of the Q&A period. Now, when we talk about the technology-based programs or the non-print materials, you will need to provide access information for those programs or any non-print materials, again, based on the schedule that we have in the invitation. And access for those materials must contain access information must contain the identification number that's supplied by North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So if you're sending information, for example, to the textbook warehouse and you're providing a list that has the bid number, the name of the title, the ISBN, and the access information, it must be included. The bid number must be included on that document so that it's easily identifiable by textbook warehouse or anyone from the public who may want to have access to what you submit. We're also asking for navigation instructions for non-print materials. So if you're submitting a technology-based program or any other non-print materials, there need to be specific instructions on how to navigate all of the submitted digital materials through the online platform. This is extremely important for you as a publisher because if the reviewers, including the commissioners and advisors, if they cannot navigate your materials, it is more difficult for them to evaluate the materials. It would be hard for them to find things and locate things. So it's to your advantage to provide the best instructions that you can provide so that they have a thorough understanding of how to get through and review your materials, those things that are digital. So we're asking that your navigation instructions be provided by video or screencast that's no longer than 10 minutes in length. So you've got 10 minutes to just explain how to get to your materials, how to navigate them, how to review them, all those things necessary for them to be able to see everything that you would like for them to see to include in their evaluation of your materials. A link for access to your video or screencast must be submitted through the platform. So you'll see that when you go into the platform. That'll be a part of the form that you will complete. And again, there's a timeline for that as well. All that's in the invitation. And the last item here is extremely important because we need to have access to your instructions and to your materials. Everything must work at all times through October 6th. Now that's the tentative date when it would go to the board for approval. And so in the event that we have meetings for the commissioners after evaluation, we may have board members that ask questions about material. So there may be a need to go back to your materials prior to the end of the process. So it's really key that you make sure that access is available at all times through October 6, 2022. So we also ask for contact information for tech support. That's going to be provided in your submission, and you'll see a question for that on your form. All right, so I'll stop for just a minute. That was our conversation about your bid proposals and some things that would need to go along with that in terms of things that would need to be available. We also know that whenever you are working through this process, that you need to be really cautious and pay attention to the pages in the invitation that highlight bid proposal, as well as the checklist at the back, just to be sure that you have everything that's required. Again, I'm doing a high-level overview here with some details, but it's important that you let the invitation guide everything that you do. That is your guiding document. We also want to make sure that when you have the technology-based or the non-print materials, that reviewers don't have to go anywhere and set up anything and provide email addresses and things like that. It should be a login that you provide, and when they use your login, the reviewers should just be able to get right to your materials. So keep that in mind as well. All right, let's move on and talk about bid samples. So in talking about bid samples, again, you're requesting identification numbers, and these identification numbers are extremely important for your bid samples. The ID numbers will be in the cost proposal spreadsheet, so we know that we have a way of identifying your bids there. But when you submit your samples, we also need a way of identifying the samples. So again, we'll be asking that you have for sure the bid number in the file name for one. That'll be one way to help us. Now for the DPI official samples, again, the print materials must be submitted to the warehouse in print, and then the technology-based or non-print samples must be submitted on a list with login and access information. So you would be mailing all of that to the textbook warehouse. If it's a print, if it's a book, and if it's digital, then you would mail the information along with that to the textbook warehouse. The official samples must be shipped as explained in the 2022 invitation. So there's some parameters and guidelines for those official samples. So you want to make sure that you check the invitation to be sure to get that right as well. All right, so now we want to start looking at some of the dates that are outlined in the invitation. So for your bid sample materials, they must be submitted electronically through the platform for publishers no earlier than May 9th and no later than May 16th. The DPI official sample must be mailed to the textbook warehouse on the same timeline, no earlier than May 9th and no later than May 16th. So these dates are on the tentative schedule that are in the invitation, so you'll be able to see all of the dates together in that document. All right, that was an important reminder, but there are a few more important reminders that I want to go over with you. And then we're going to also, during this part, go through the invitation and some specifics in the invitation too. All right, so coming up, written questions are due. So some of you have sent in questions already. Continue to send your questions in. If this meeting generates more questions, please send those questions in. If you get more questions after the meeting, please send those questions in. But your deadline for submitting your written questions in reference to the information in the 2022 invitation is March the 21st by 2 p.m. You've been asked to submit those questions in email, in writing, to Kina Brands. This is her email. And again, the time is by 2 p.m. on March the 21st. So please be sure to adhere to that timeline. Otherwise, we will not be able to accept your questions after that specific timeline that's given. Now, once you do the hard work of thinking of the questions and submitting those questions, then DPI staff will turn around and create the responses that go along with those questions. All of the questions that you submit will be answered, and they will be distributed back to publishers by March 29th, 2022. So what that looks like would be you're sending your things in individually. You may be sending in a question here, question there. You may have a document and you're gathering all your questions and you send the document in by the deadline. But when Kina gets the questions, she's looking at those questions by category or topic, and then she's providing those questions to key staff members who can generate the response for them. She collects the responses back. So Kina's collecting questions and she's collecting responses. And once Kina collects the responses, those responses, as well as the questions, are put into a comprehensive document, and then that document will be mailed out through the publisher's registry. So everybody on the publisher's registry will have access to these questions and answers. Those of you may be considering now that you're going to participate in the bid process. Some of you may be undecided. So you're going to receive the questions and answers as well, because right now you may not be thinking of some things. And then later on, when you go back and you have conversation, you may want to participate, but you may have questions, or you may not think of some of the questions that others have. So it's really a great way for everybody to have access to all the questions that are asked and the answers that are provided as well. So that would be no later than March the 29th. You'll receive that information back through the publisher's registry. Again, keep your questions for today so that you can provide those to Kina as well. All right, so looking at some other dates, we have the April 28th date, which is when your bid proposals need to be submitted. You will submit them electronically through the platform for publishers, and you will submit them by hard copy in the mail. So they need to be received at DPI on April 28th by 2 p.m. Your hard copies, April 28th, DPI by 2 p.m. Your electronic versions must be uploaded and submitted in the platform for publishers also by April 28th, 2 p.m. So please keep that date in mind. That's the next date coming up after the questions are due. The electronic copies and hard copies both are going to be submitted and received by 2 p.m. on April 28th, and then DPI will open the bids on the same date. Information about the bid submission due date and the bid opening are in the tentative schedule in the invitation. All right, so another important date is when your bid samples are due. So once you get all of your bid information in, your bid proposals, and you've decided what you're going to bid as far as your materials, then you have to make sure that you gather the samples that will be needed for the evaluators and the reviewers to be able to do a fair evaluation and review of your materials. So your electronic bid samples and correlations for evaluation must be submitted through the platform for publishers on May 16th or by May 16th. Now, you will have access prior to May 16th, but that is the deadline that you must submit all of your bid sample materials. Now, keep in mind that these are going to be submitted through the platform. So again, when you get ready to go to the platform to submit these bid samples, you need to have everything ready to just go in. You'll be completing a form, but you'll be able to upload into that form. There'll be certain limitations and restrictions about the number of files and all of the sizes and all of those things, but that information will be provided to you as the information about the platform is shared. But I just wanted to make sure that I emphasize, have everything together, or whoever is doing the entry or the submission on the platform should have everything that's needed to go into that platform for your bid samples. We also want the official samples of the print sample materials submitted to the textbook warehouse in print, and then the technology-based and non-print samples submitted on a list with login and access information. So I said that earlier. So the third thing would be correlations. We hadn't talked about correlations yet, but the correlations must be submitted with the official samples as well as in the platform. So you'll be submitting your correlations. So at the time when you get ready to ship off to the warehouse or sit down and upload to the platform, those correlations need to be ready and together to submit along with your bid samples. And we do expect to have the correlations, because the correlations would be how you're saying that the materials are aligned. But keep in mind that advisors will also go through to see what their thoughts are about the alignment as well. Your document will just help them locate things, but they will go through and make their own judgment about the alignment to standards. All right, then this is an extremely important date for evaluation week. Right now, we have tentatively June the 12th scheduled for publisher presentations, and then evaluation week occurring June 13th through 17th. We do know that on the day of publisher presentations, in the past, when it's been in person, publishers are expected to be in person and do their presentations to the text for the textbook commission. But if we happen to have to go to a virtual format, then last year we did that and we had publishers to present through a WebEx. More information will be coming forward when we get closer to June to see what's happening, if we're still able to do in-person things, and if we are, then more than likely the meeting will be in person. But if not, there's information in the invitation that shows you, what happens if it's in person, what happens if it's virtual. So again, the invitation is going to have the details that you need for either meeting mode. All right, for information regarding the invitation and just everything about textbook adoption, you need to look at the textbook adoption webpage. I have the information here on this page as far as the link. If you would go to the DPI website, dpi.nc.gov, you would select district and schools, you would select district operations, and then you would select textbook adoption. And then I'll bring you to this page where you will see a link for the invitation. And then on the navigation bar on the right, at that point, you would also see additional options for textbook adoption. So information for publishers, publishers registry, textbook adoption process. So there are numerous topics that you can select from. So if you have not already visited the website, I would advise you to go to the state website and find this textbook adoption page and be sure that you go through each of the topics to see if there's information there that will be useful for you, but also useful for anybody else who may be assisting with parts of the bid proposal or the bid samples. It just would be good for them to familiarize themselves with the information about the process. So it can be found here. This information is more high level than it is in the invitation, but it does provide some guidance for things that you have to know and understand about the process. All right, so we have the NC platform for publishers. And again, this platform is key for everything that you all are going to be doing in terms of your bid proposal submission and your bid sample submission. DPI is going to provide the link through the publisher's registry for you to submit that request for your bid identification number. So that'll be the next thing that happens after this meeting. Then you'll put in your request for your ID numbers, and you're going to receive, once you put in that request, you'll receive your bid ID numbers, and in addition to that, you're going to receive information about how to access the NC site for publishers. So you'll get that email back whenever you generate your request for ID number. So it's kind of like an exchange. You request ID numbers and you get information to access the site as well as the ID numbers. All right, in the NC platform, you'll be able to access the invitation, access the cost proposal form, and any other documents required in the bid submission process. You'll be able to submit the bid proposal, and you'll be able to submit your bid materials and correlations for evaluation. So it's kind of the place where everything can go for you all, but it's also the place where you can find the things that you need. Here, as I talked about earlier, are some examples for file naming. So for your bid proposal, again, we talked about using your company name and then 2022 cost proposal. So if you want to further identify your bid proposal for social studies or for ELD, then you could actually put that at the back and underscore, and then that after the 2022 cost proposal, you can put it there. Some publishers have also put the name of the person who's submitting information in the file name. That part's up to you, but this is what we need to see in the file name, this part right here on the screen. Also, for your bid samples, you may do this, put the bid identification number, the company name, the title of the book, and then the grade level or the course that the book is evaluated for. That's very helpful to be sure that, as we have assignments to people about what they're reviewing, and as we're setting things up for people to review them, it just helps to be sure everything is in the right place. So this information will be sent in your email that you get relative to your bid ID numbers and your access to the site. All right, so we'll make sure that if you have any questions on any of this information about the platform, that you also include those in your email to Kina. I'll pause for just a minute. Now, this presentation, these slides, will be available on the website. I will get those posted probably no later than Monday. They may go up today, but no later than Monday. All right, so probably the part everybody's been really waiting for is the conversation about the massive 2022 invitation. This document is huge. It's a lot of information, and it's not something that you can just sit down and read from cover to cover. We have a table of contents, which is good because that can help guide you to the right place. But again, I would recommend looking through the entire document because they're just important pieces of information throughout on all the pages. So even if initially you're looking at specific things that you want to see, like you may go to the bid proposal information page, or you may say, hey, let me look at the criteria sheets for social studies, then you still need to go back because the stuff that's going to help you with your bid proposal, the stuff that's going to help you with your bid samples, all of that information is throughout the document. So please make sure you utilize the table of contents, but that you try to review the entire 2022 invitation. So I've mentioned the guidelines and parameters probably ad nauseum, but it's important again that you read the entire invitation, and you will see, as you see here on the screen, some of the important pages are that second page after the title sheet, the introduction and requirements, and then the beginning of the submission parameters on page 1, and those continue on page 2. So you can see that specific information about your submissions are there, and you would need to be sure to read that as it's the beginning piece of talking about the electronic PDFs and what happens for digital things and your navigation instructions and all of those things. So this would be a very good start for that. Then we have specific pages, as you just saw in the table of contents, where it's specifically about the bid proposal. So there's a bulleted list of the things that you need to provide. What is considered the bid proposal? Sometimes we get that question. So we try to be very clear here in bulleting the information and saying, hey, your bid proposal will include this, and then using bullets to highlight what that means. So take a look at this, see if you have any questions, if any questions were generated from today, or if you have any questions just from looking at the document. So maybe if something isn't totally clear to you, or you just need additional details about the information, please be sure to capture that in a question for Kina. All right, some more details that are in the guidelines and parameters of the invitation. You want to make sure that everybody who's going to be involved in this process, if it's the bid submission, if it's the sample submission, if it's displays when the evaluation week occurs, everyone involved in this really needs to understand these parameters and guidelines, because there's specific parameters and guidelines for each of those things. But then again, throughout the document, there are specifics as well. So you need to make sure that everybody has access to this document who will be participating in setting up your bid or providing samples. All right, so the infamous blackout period. So let me go over the 2 blackout periods that we have in as a part of our textbook adoption process. So the first blackout period involves State Board of Education members, DPI staff, textbook commissioners. When we talk about the blackout period for these groups of people, it's at no time after the board approves the invitation, which they approved on March the 3rd, until the state board adopts the list of textbooks. So that's going to be tentatively in October. So you're not able to meet privately with any of the commissioners or board members or any of the people in this list. You can't have a private meeting with these people to discuss anything about your bid. So that's the blackout, the first blackout period that we have from the time the state board approves the invitation until the state board adopts. State board, DPI, textbook commission, you're not allowed to do any private meetings. We also have a second blackout period, which is for sampling and promotion. So no sampling or promotion of your textbooks that are under consideration for adoption. Sometimes people think, I can't talk about any of my books. No, that's not the case. It's those things that you have included in your bid document that would be under consideration for adoption. You will not be able to sample or promote those textbooks. All right, so that'll be from the date that the state board approves the invitation, which again was March the 3rd, until the day after the textbook commissioner's evaluation sessions with the advisors. So currently that would be that June 17th date is the last day. So it would be June the 18th. That's tentatively based on what's on the schedule now. So those are the two blackout periods. It's a blackout period for meeting privately with state board, DPI, textbook commission, and then it's a blackout from sampling and promoting books that you have in your bid. So there's a little bit more detail about that information. So promotion includes displays at conferences, workshops, seminars, or other similar activities in North Carolina. All right, so we don't want to have any type of conversations, displays, promotions, samples about anything that you have on your bid sheet that's going to be under consideration for adoption. So just want to be sure that I make that point very clear because that's important to you in your participation in the bid process. So I'm going to stop for just a minute, let you think about the two blackout periods that I've talked about and see if you have questions that you want to jot down. This being the first with the state board, DPI, textbook commission. And looking at the time frame of the blackouts as well and what you're not allowed to do is important too. And then again, looking at the sampling restrictions, sampling and promotion restrictions. I often get questions about the blackout period, so I really think it is important to talk about it like this here today, just so that even if you're just trying to absorb it and synthesize it, it would still give you an opportunity to present that question to Kina if you still don't understand what the blackout period means. So hopefully the slides made it clear, but if not, you can always submit it as a question. All right, so we're back to the invitation. And again, emphasizing read the entire invitation and make sure that anybody else involved is going to read this invitation so that they know what the guidelines and the parameters are for whatever part they're going to be handling. Some of the key items in the invitation, again, the introduction requirements, the submission parameters, which will be on the bottom of page 1 as you see here, as well as on page 2. That tentative schedule, which begins on page 6, that's extremely important as well. That gives you all the dates of textbook commission meetings, but it also includes all of your deadlines and also the state board meetings where things will be presented. So this is your guideline for understanding and knowing when everything is happening and what's happening. And then the third thing that I have on this slide, again, is your bid proposal information. Just wanting to emphasize that the bid proposal information is in the invitation. This is page 12, but it is also on a checklist at the back. I would emphasize looking at it within the invitation. The checklist is just a checklist. All of your details are going to be here on this page or within the pages of the invitation that spell out all of the specifics that you need. So my go-to is to always say, go back to the invitation, go back to the page where that information is for your guidelines. All right, so I mentioned earlier that we have criteria, evaluation criteria within the invitation. So here's just samples of what you would see for English language development and social studies. So there's a list of the areas for adoption. So you can see that this is K-12 for ELD. You see a listing of each grade level, kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, all the way down through grade 12. You see an example of a criteria sheet beside that. This is what the criteria sheets will look like for ELD. The criteria sheets are grouped for K5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. And then there's also a criteria sheet for EC because we do invite EC and EL teachers to look at the materials as well, because as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that these resources are good for all students. And so that review is included, but the commissioners, again, make their own judgments about the materials in the end. They do their own evaluations and their reports, but we do have the advisors to come in and look at all of the things I mentioned. Also have the same information for social studies. We have the specific content areas listed or the grade levels. So you can see here kindergarten through grade 8. And then we have 4 courses: founding principles, American history and world history, and economics and personal finance. So those would be the ones that are in consideration for social studies. Again, you see that you have a criteria sheet for social studies. And again, these are going to be grouped. You're going to have the specific grade levels, and then you'll have ones for the specific courses for social studies. Each of these also, I did make a screenshot and put it on the page here, but each content area, as we do in all of our invitations, they have an overview that was written by the content consultants. And that overview kind of addresses the content area, the standards for the content area, and some other things for consideration. So you probably would like to read that overview as well. That'll be embedded in the invitation. That comes right before the criteria sheets. So it'll be available for you for English language development, and then there'll be a separate one available for you for social studies. All right, so again, we're emphasizing reading the invitation and making sure that anybody that's going to be involved in your bid process, whether it's a bid submission or samples, that they're also privy to the information in the invitation. I wanted to highlight for you that we did something a little bit different this year with the invitation because of the current situation with mask and social distancing and everything not quite being open just yet and not knowing where we might be by June. So the way that this was planned is that we included information for if the meeting might be in person, but we also included information for if the meeting might be virtual. So I wanted to make sure that I emphasize this. There's a statement at the top of the document that says they may be virtual if conditions at the time are not conducive to safe social distancing in person. So if we're not able to keep our commissioners and our teachers safe in the environment of a hotel meeting room, then we would definitely have our meeting virtual, which we did that last year. So, we would use WebEx and do the things that we did last year. Also, the guidelines have what you do if we are going to be in person. If the meeting is virtual, you will have already provided your materials in electronic format. You're providing the PDFs of the print materials. You're providing your digital materials with links and access and sign-on information. You're providing navigation information. And for either way, you're providing correlation. So you're already really submitting everything that would be needed if the meeting had to go virtual. If the meeting is going to be in person, I do encourage you to look at that side, especially of the information, because if the meeting is going to be in person and you have print materials, there is an expectation for you to set up print materials for the reviewers on display tables. We would go back to what we've done over the past years, which is to have tables for publishers. You would be assigned a table or tables, depending on the number of bids you have. You would set up your print materials so that people could actually touch and go through the print materials. And then you would also set up your electronic materials. So you'd have two copies of print materials, and then you would have two sets of, or two devices or two computers for each grade band, and access information for your digital materials so that the reviewers would be able to look at your print materials in print, and they would be able to look at your electronic materials on your laptops. So please read through that, because you may have questions that you need to send to Kina before the question period is up about the information there. We tried to do a parallel, but there may be some instances where the information for one side goes a little bit further down than for the other side. So please be sure to look at both sides to make sure you understand the requirements for an in-person meeting versus a virtual meeting. So I tried to be as clear as possible there, but it could be you may have some questions. Just really trying to emphasize this because I think that while you have the opportunity to ask questions, you won't know what questions you have if you haven't looked at this. So that is why it's important for you to review over these things so that if you do have questions, you can ask them now, because later on, we may not be able to answer them as we can now. We can pretty much get your question and give you all these details about, what the answer is and how you would go about doing the thing you're asking about doing, or providing the thing you're asking about providing. So don't miss the opportunity. And you have to read the invitation to be sure that you're not missing out on something that you really need. So I just wanted to mention here, we will let you know, we will give you, we'll try to give you enough time to know if we decide that the meeting is going to be an in-person meeting, so that you will have time to get what you need to the hotel. We're still working with getting the hotel, but that information, of course, will be provided as soon as all the details are finalized. You'll receive that information. It'll be on the web, because we'll set up the meeting date closer to June on the website, on the Textbook Commission meetings page. So just gather your thoughts about evaluation, deliberation, and reconsideration, because this is the information that I'm discussing, especially for evaluation. Sometimes the deliberations part is not as hard to have an in-person meeting because we have fewer people. It really just consists of our textbook commissioners, and the textbook commissioners did meet in person in 2021 for their deliberations meeting. So the setup for the in-person and virtual, the document guidelines are just set this way for the evaluation meeting. Deliberation meeting would be TBD, because that's just a meeting where the commissioners come together and they have discussion and they vote. So it wouldn't be anything that publishers are having to set up or do at that meeting, because at that point they have all your information anyway electronically. So it would just be a matter of us determining the place and if it's going to be in person or virtual. All right, so what's next? So you may have a lot of thoughts now about, wow, are we going to participate in this process? If we are, let's look at that timeline. Woo, these dates are coming up fast. We're going to be able to do this. We've got to get our bid ID numbers. So there's probably a lot going through your mind right now about what would be your next steps. As I mentioned before, there are checklists at the back of the invitation, and those checklists hopefully can help guide you. But the checklist does contain the page numbers, because my solid advice is to go back to the information within the invitation to be sure that you're getting everything that you need, or that you have everything that you need for your bid proposal submission, your bid sample submissions. And also wanting you to be sure you follow the guidelines for the correlations and provide appropriate correlations, so that your materials are not disqualified. Correlations are key. Our reviewers need those. And so if you have questions about the correlations, please be sure to put that in an email to Kina, so that we can get that answered prior to moving on to the next step. All right, so let's look at what's next, what I've outlined as next steps. Next steps would be, first of all, as I've said a million times today, follow the guidelines and parameters in the 2022 invitation, read it, share it with others. Be sure that you're checking back when you're putting things together to submit. Have your things ready to submit when you sit down in front of the platform. Your file names are right, that you have all the files that you need, so that you're just ready to upload and respond to things in the form. Also, something that you need to do is determine the number of bid ID numbers that you need to request. There may be some guidelines and parameters in there where you may say, I was thinking about bidding these materials, but I don't know if they're going to be ready by the time. And I know that if I put them in the bid process, they have to have this, and this. So you would make the determination of how many bid numbers to request. So once you make that request, remember, you can add more numbers if you decide that you want to present more bids in the process, or you can take numbers out. You can take numbers away. That's totally up to you. And you'll decide that probably as you're thinking about the invitation and bids and cost proposal forms and all the things that we've talked about here today. Also want to mention that you should definitely be prepared to adhere to the blackout period guidelines. And remember, we've got 2 blackout periods. We have the blackout period that involves the State Board of Education members, the textbook commission members, and DPI staff. And then we have the sampling and promotion guidelines, which refer to you being able to go to conventions, meetings, seminars, and present. You would not be able to present in North Carolina on any of the materials that you put in your bid proposal. That's the main thing about the sampling and promotion guideline. That blackout period ends earlier because that blackout period is designed so that our advisors are not going to conferences and hearing you present about materials, and then they're being selected to be advisors and they're coming in reviewing materials that you've presented about at a conference. So that's why it's going on now. Advisors have not been selected, and we don't want the pool of advisors to be tainted by any information. So you're currently under blackout. So just keep that in mind. Also, the other piece of advice would be to be sure to meet all due dates and deadlines. You want to make sure that you're looking at that tentative schedule. And if anything has to change, please know that I would definitely send information out, like if there was an update in the schedule, if the invitation was updated because dates were updated, it would be posted on the webpage, but then I would also be sending that out as a clarification to whoever's designated for clarification. So you're still wanting to make sure that you have that invitation in front of you, that you've pulled the document that has all the dates on it, and that you're just aware of all your deadlines and trying to meet those. So again, I'll stop here. We've had an intensive conversation at a broad level of the invitation and all of the requirements and things in the invitation relative to bid proposals, dates, and bid samples. So you do need to really consider if you have any questions about those things. And you may have questions outside of that, outside of the invitation. You have other questions. I know sometimes we get the enrollment questions. So those are perfectly fine as well. So other questions that you have that may not be about things that I've covered here today, you submit those to Kina as well. But all questions go to Kina. All right, so after giving you this little bit of time to think after each segment or each topic, I do want to thank you all for your time and your attention that you've given today for this meeting. I appreciate that so many of you have been thoughtful enough about the process that you felt like it was important to come to actually hear someone from DPI explaining the invitation. And I hope that I met the needs that you have currently for having information to make decisions about if you're going to participate in the process and submit bid proposals and what might happen with your bid proposals and your bid samples. I thank you so much. And again, Kina Brands is receiving your written questions, and you will have a follow-up of all the questions that are submitted. So every last single question we get, you'll be able to see the responses to those. Make sure that you have the timeline nearby so that you're always looking at that, and just let Kina know whatever questions you have as a result of that. I look forward to working with you all, and we may be able to see each other in June when we come together for evaluation and publishers presentations. But keep your eyes open for the email that indicates information about the bid request form. Thank you all so much. I hope you all have a good rest of your evening and a great weekend.